Welcome to the Apple Insider Podcast. Today I have a special guest with me, James Cridland. He's the editor of Podnews, a daily podcast newsletter. And you've written and spoken a lot on radio and podcasting. You've done copywriting and all that. And so, James Cridland, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thank you so much for asking.
And you also have a great accent for podcasting. Let me just say, I think you're the first. Well, you're originally from the UK. You're now living in Australia. So which is your accent? Is it UK or is it Australian?
It's most definitely a UK accent. I've had 50 years of doing a UK accent. I can't possibly change now.
That's right. And because you're currently in Australia, we are podcasting across time. You are living in the future. It's 7 a.m. for me. And what time is it for you?
Yeah, and it's 9 p.m. for me. So yes,
9 p.m.
So it's been a long day,
right,
that you still have to experience.
Did anything earth-shattering happen today that I need to look forward to or look out for?
Not really. No, not really.
Okay.
We're currently in lockdown again. So
oh goodness.
Yeah, I know. So therefore, frankly, there's been very little going on, which is probably a good thing.
I thought Australia was doing like really well with the whole pandemic a number of months ago, and we're kind of showing how everything was opening back up again.
Well, we've been doing pretty well in terms of not allowing anybody else in. It's almost as if it's some kind of a prison colony. I don't know, but anyway, so we've been doing pretty well in terms of that. Just over the last week or so, there's been a spate of cases. So there's 2 cases in the entire state of Queensland, I think. Maybe there are 3 now. The whole 3 of those cases means that much of the state is in complete lockdown, and we're not allowed to go anywhere, do anything, only for maybe 3 days, maybe 5 days. So it's going to come. It's going to come.
Okay.
It's going to come okay. But that's the first lockdown that we've had since April, I think.
So just 3 cases, and the country is like everybody stay home.
Yeah, and so 3 cases and the state stays home. So, it's a big deal. We've basically had very few cases, very few deaths, thankfully. But that has come with the downside of the borders just simply not being open. So if you're Australian and you're wanting to come home, it's really hard. And if you're, a Brit and you're wanting to go home every so often, then it's impossible.
Also, right.
So still, there we are.
Well, we hope that passes quickly for sure. I wanted to have a very meta podcast on the Apple Insider Podcast today because it's going to be a podcast about podcasting because of all the stuff that's been in the news and Spotify and Facebook, and we'll get all into that. But for you yourself, you've been in radio for a long time. What made you make the transition to get into podcasting, and why are you so passionate about it that you would write about it, all the time?
Every single day.
Every day, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been involved in radio since the late 1980s, a long, long time. But I started being involved in what the future of audio was in the early 2000s. So I was looking after a website for Virgin Radio in London, which was Richard Branson's radio station. And one of the things that we were doing is we were the first radio station to stream online in Europe. We were the first radio station to do, a bunch of really interesting things. And one of those was to have the first radio app in the world where you could tune into us in glorious 9 kilobits a second audio quality.
Wow.
Feel the quality. But also that same year, which was 2005, we launched the first daily podcast from a radio station. So just to put that into context, that was January of 2005. Steve Jobs only put podcasting into the iPod in the middle of the year, in June. So it was very, very early times. So I've been, sort of really involved in on-demand audio and podcasting ever since then, really.
That's awesome. So because you have this great experience, and I think you really have great foresight into what's coming, I want your thoughts on Spotify first. And so Spotify has been making the play, I would say the past 2 years, to really go with those exclusive shows. You got Joe Rogan, Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard, and they're announcing more and more exclusives seemingly every month. These exclusives are a little different than what Apple has now offered, and we'll get to that in a moment. Just to be clear, these exclusives are not things you have to pay for. They're just shows that you have to listen using Spotify's app. And so it is a platform lock-in play, not necessarily a subscription play, at least just yet. What are your overall thoughts about these kinds of exclusives going to Spotify?
Yeah, I mean, Spotify has a number of different plans here. Some of them are exclusive. So if you listen to Joe Rogan, the only way that you can get Joe Rogan is on the Spotify app, and that's all fine. And then you have things like Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen, where that show is available everywhere, including Apple, but there is a window where you can only get it exclusive in the Spotify app. And then you also have Spotify. They own a couple of big podcast hosts, Anchor and Megaphone. And so therefore they are also making a bunch of their shows available, of course, across the internet, but paid for by Spotify with Spotify advertising in them. So there's a bunch of sort of different things that they're doing. It seems to be working very well for them. So if you have a look at human beings, people who listen to podcasts, then you can see that there's a good amount now who are using Spotify, possibly more people using Spotify to listen to podcasts than Apple. And that's a big deal. Now, that's not the case in terms of downloads, because people who use Apple Podcasts tend to download quite a few different shows. But in terms of just, human beings using Spotify, there's a bunch of people now who are consuming all of their podcasts through Spotify. And that, of course, is where Spotify wants to go, because that way Spotify can sell advertising to those people, can lock people into the platform where, of course, they can also get music if they pay for that as well. And so it's beneficial for them to keep people within the Spotify ecosystem. And their plan is to be the destination for audio.
So I've been in podcasting for a while, back when you had to hard code your RSS feed in XML and upload a text file to a server. I think in the indie podcast world, especially a lot of us who have been in it in a long time, we loved it because it was an open venue. Like, it was an open media. You can use any app you want, even if you just want to download MP3 files to your computer. And podcasts were that. Podcasts, by definition, were MP3 or audio files served through an RSS feed that's publicly available on the internet. And some people now feel like these exclusive shows is not really a podcast anymore. This is something different. Do you feel like there's a distinction there? Are we losing something because of we've lost some openness with these shows?
Well, I mean, I think the two sides of that conversation. I think one side of that conversation is very much focusing on what a podcast is. And what we might think a podcast is from a technical point of view isn't necessarily what normal human beings think a podcast is. The most popular platform to listen to podcasts in the US by quite a margin is a thing called YouTube. Now, YouTube is not a podcast app. It doesn't use RSS feeds. It doesn't use enclosures in MP3 or AAC format. It doesn't use, non-DRM'd, downloadable stuff. It's a very different experience. But for audio first, that is what a lot of people are saying that they listen to podcasts on. Now, quite a lot of people will turn around and say, well, James, that's not a podcast. Well, that's fine. But if people are calling something a duck, it's probably a duck. So at the end of the day, I kind of am guided by what normal human beings are saying on this. But to come back to your point around, podcasting has always been a very level playing field. Anybody can get involved, and that really hasn't changed. If you have an RSS feed and you have MP3 or AAC files, you can get that into Spotify, you can get that into Apple Music, you can get that into Amazon Music, into a bunch of these individual apps, and you can still do that now. And in fact, I still write my own RSS feed and upload audio onto my own server, and it's available on Spotify and on Apple just as well as everything else is. So you can still do that.
Yeah.
I think one of the difficulties, if you're getting involved into podcasting now, is that there are an awful lot of podcasts out there. So Apple has broken the 2 million mark recently.
Wow.
And in fact, if you have a look overall, including the podcasts which are available only on Spotify and podcasts which are available in other platforms as well, then there are over 4 million RSS feeds with podcasts out there. That is an awful lot of content, and it's therefore much harder to find a great show than if you were going to find This Week in Tech back in 2006. That was an awful lot easier than it is now. So, clearly it is much harder to be a small creator. It really helps if you're part of a large podcast network, if you've got, iHeartRadio promoting you and all that kind of stuff, then that certainly helps. But it doesn't mean that you can't get involved if you're just, one person by themselves. And I think, the advent of free podcast hosts like Anchor, which Spotify owns, like Red Circle, Launchpad, which is owned by Podcast One, and so on and so forth, those free podcast hosts are again leveling that playing field, so that you don't even need a credit card to start being involved and getting your show out there, and that's a great thing.
Yeah, and I think for people wanting to get into podcast creation, you're absolutely right. The tools we have today make that much easier. Again, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was difficult. Yeah, you had to learn how to XML and RSS. So I think as a creator, you have more tools and access to get to listeners. But as far as discoverability, like you were saying, and exclusivity, Apple now has a podcast subscription service, and there are certain shows, either paid for exclusive content or what have you, that you could only use or listen in the Apple Podcasts app. Then Spotify has their exclusives. Amazon Prime is now making their play for their exclusives. For the typical listener or user, not someone creating podcasts, but just one who wants to listen to shows that they would enjoy, do you think that this kind of fracturing of podcast, meaning you have to go to this app for this one and this app for this one, is that going to make it a worse experience for the average listener? I don't know about you, but I have 4 podcast apps on my phone, but most people do not. Most people are going to use one app to listen to podcasts. And if your show, your podcast, your exclusive subscription is not in that one, you're probably not going to reach that listener. So I guess I'm asking, is that fracturing of this podcast space, is that good for discoverability and for ease of listening to podcasts?
Well, I think the answer is probably both yes and no. So it's bad for audiences if they have to be bullied into downloading specific apps to listen to specific shows, although we are quite used to that in the video world. We're quite used to shows only being available on Netflix or only being available on Hulu or on any of the other platforms there. So we're kind of used to this in the world of video, but maybe not so much in the world of audio. So it's bad from that point of view. However, looking at it the other way round, it does mean that Spotify, for example, is much more likely to put serious money into promoting some of their shows. And I remember, when I was in Chicago this time a year and a half ago, I was seeing, ad banners all over town. They're not called ad banners, are they? Those big things next to the bus stop.
Billboards?
Yes, billboards. Thank you. It's been a long day. I was seeing a bunch of those for individual Spotify shows, that Spotify were really piling some cash into. Now, would they have done that as much if they were, just pushing a show which you could get anywhere? I don't think so. So I think it's probably a good thing for getting the understanding of what a podcast is and how to find individual shows and all of that. I think it's a good thing from that point of view. But yeah, I think Adam Curry, for example, is very, very keen on not calling these things podcasts and calling them netcasts or something else instead, because he thinks that they don't qualify as being a podcast if they're not, open anymore. Again, I'm not so sure about that, but I can see where he's coming from. And and I think that, we need to be a little bit more clear when we're talking about exclusive podcasts, Spoticasts, Amazon, casts and so on and so forth. I think we just need to be careful there.
Yeah, I think Leo Laporte really tried to make the netcast thing catch on too, and I don't think it has. I think we're with podcasts now for the long haul.
Yes, he did. No, he was doing that for a long
Yes.
time, and but I think he had a very good point, which was that the word podcast, because it contains a bit of the iPod in it. I mean, firstly,
Oh, yeah.
very out of date. Because who listens to a podcast on an iPod anymore?
Right.
But also, secondly, he was worried that Apple might go away and trademark that particular name. And I know that Apple have been quite cautious around people who have used the pod portmanteau way of actually, naming things. They haven't talked to me about Podnews, but I do know that they've talked to a bunch of folk. So I can well see that his plan there was to actually make sure that Netcast would be a trademark that could be used for all of netcasting.
Right.
And I can kind of see his point of view there. Weirdly enough, LG ended up bagging that particular trademark for something to do with fridges, I think. So who knows what's going on there.
Wow.
Anyway, it's available again if you want it.
Yeah, very good. So Apple has long been kind of the silent curator. I don't know if curator would you call it, but they've had the iTunes podcast directory, which powered many, many podcast apps through the years.
Yeah.
It was the free directory. You could submit your show. There was no money changing hands. And they were kind of like the benevolent arbiter of like the podcast directory, basically, until recently. And so now they have paid subscription content, and you can offer exclusive or bonus content through Apple Podcasts directly. Curious, there's no Apple Podcast app for Android yet, so there's a huge portion of listeners that you couldn't reach with those subscriptions or exclusive content. But you can do that now on Apple, and they take the 30% cut from your subscribers, at least in the first year, 15% the second.
Yes, at least right now they do, yeah.
Right now. What are your thoughts on that and Apple now offering those kind of paid subscriptions?
Well, look, I mean, I think Apple have done a couple of things this year. One of the things that they have done is redesigned the way that you get podcasts into Apple Podcasts, and they've rebuilt the Apple Podcasts Connect, which was a dreadful, miserable failure, and everything broke.
Yeah.
And people were, I think what was frustrating to many podcasters was that it was completely broken. Apple knew it was completely broken, and Apple never said anything. So as a result, if you were a podcast consultant and you were there saying, I'm sorry, I can't get you into Apple at the moment because Apple's broken, they would turn around and say, well, where's the press? You're just making this up. You're just a useless consultant.
Yeah.
And so you ended up, it ended up really hurting the industry. They also made quite a few changes in terms of the way that podcasts were actually appearing in their app, to the point where if you had a daily podcast, it would take sometimes 3 days to update your individual show. So that was completely useless. So from that point of view, that was a pretty bad experience, and a very Apple-y experience of not saying anything at all, not coming out and fessing up and saying, we've messed up, we're really sorry. And that was a bit sad. But on the other side, I think that the Apple subscriptions stuff that they've been doing, their paid subscription model, has been really well thought out. They've done it in a very good way where you can subscribe to channels, so you can get a bunch of different shows. You can subscribe to individual shows if you want. You can pay in certain ways. You can get money off for buying a year in advance. You can do all of this kind of clever stuff. And they've done that in a really clever way, and in a way where they've obviously been talking to a bunch of different podcasters and come up with some really good plans. So I think what they've done there is really good and really smartly done. And I think what excites me is that then opens up alternative business models in podcasting for pretty well the first time. No longer do I have to play a kids podcast to my daughter that has advertising in there.
Right.
I can actually just pay money and get rid of the advertising. That's a great thing. There are some people who are producing audio to meditate to. There are some people who are producing, different audio, which is just free from advertising, free from the, having to please every advertiser, that is actually in there. So I think from that point of view, that really opens up Apple Podcasts to be a very creative place, and a place where you will hear some really innovative ideas for content in the future. So I think Apple has done a fantastic job there.
So as getting into podcasting has been made easier for creators with all the free tools out there now, if you want to monetize your podcast through these kinds of subscription services and things like that, I know at least for me, it now feels like the work to produce an episode is exponentially increasing. For instance, to offer an ad-free version of the show, previously before Apple launched this, I would do it to Patreon because that was the platform that, everybody knows Patreon. And so I would do that. And now there's kind of a whole third step. I have my free public episode. I publish that to our host. And then I have the Patreon episode, which is an MP3, and I do that ad-free, edit that. But now I also have to do it in Apple, which Apple only accepts WAV or FLAC files. So I have to export a third file there. And because their show notes have been broken as far as their HTML links, and they haven't really said anything about that publicly, but we all know it's broken. You can't click links in Apple Podcasts. So now I have to do that whole third thing.
Well, do we know it? Do we know it's broken, or is that just the way that it'll always work in the future?
We don't
even know that. But
supposedly when Apple Podcast subscriptions were just launching, someone from Apple reached out to me to get like artwork together for our channel for AppleInsider. And I did ask them directly, is this something that's going to be fixed? And they did say like, yes, it will be fixed soon. So I don't think it will last this way forever. I really hope not. Because again, then you have to have two versions of your show notes too to do that.
Indeed.
And so if I want to offer a Spotify subscription, that would be a fourth thing. Do you think that this is sustainable for podcast creators to have to offer subscriptions everywhere so you can reach those listeners who would pay for your show? Or do you think podcasters are just going to choose a platform, stick to it, and just say, if you want it, you have to listen to it here?
There's probably two things there. I think one thing is that Apple have been very clever in terms of their pricing. So it does mean that you can offer your show somewhere else, as long as they are price parity. Then you can offer a show on Spotify as well as on Apple as well as on Patreon. And again, I think that's a bright plan. I think one of the weird things about podcasting in the whole Apple world is that Apple has never really been one for APIs, has never been one for any access into any of the Apple ecosystem.
Right.
And what that essentially means, therefore, is that there's no APIs into uploading a special version of your show directly from your audio editor or directly from Descript or whatever it is that you end up using. And so there's a lot of manual steps here. And that's a bit frustrating. There are also manual steps, of course, in actually going into the Apple Podcasts Connect and grabbing the data about who's listening and how many people you have and all of this kind of stuff, because there's no APIs into that either.
Right.
And that is, I think, a bit of a frustration. I'm sure that, I'd like to think that it will get fixed, eventually. But I think that that's something that Apple are still working on. Is it getting harder? Yeah, absolutely it is. And I think it's certainly getting harder if you end up offering, special additional versions of shows, ad-free versions. What you could do in terms of ad-free, incidentally, is you could use dynamic ad insertion. And then you're essentially making an ad-free show, upload that one to Apple, and just and then upload exactly the same show with the ad points to your normal podcast host, and then hey presto, you've theoretically done no extra work, but it's still a little bit of extra sort of fiddling around.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, I think some of the tools will clearly take a little bit of time to get there. I mean, if you edit your audio with Descript as one example, then that has inbuilt APIs for quite a lot of the podcast hosts. So you can press one button and it just uploads.
Right.
The same for Hindenburg Journalist Pro, which is the audio editor I use. So, so those do exist, but not yet for the Apple Podcasts premium host.
Right.
And that's something that, clearly needs to be done. I mean, I would probably step back a little bit and just say, I wonder, I've not read all of the terms and conditions, but I do wonder whether you can offer a subscription version of your podcast, which is actually exactly the same, but it's the version of your podcast where you want to allow your audience to help pay for it. And so if you like to, you can, a little bit like shareware. If you like to, you can pay $5 a month, and that will be a lovely thing. The rules around using Patreon are you don't need to give people extra things if you don't want to.
Right.
And so it may well be that you can actually, get away without doing that if you feel that that's right for your audience. If your audience are comfortable enough, then maybe that's an interesting way. And that's of course the plan. If you watch a Patreon-supported YouTube show,
right,
then quite a lot of the times you end up just seeing people with their names up in lights at the end of a show, and you think, well, that's
right,
all that people are interested in.
That is one of the things that you can't do with the Apple Podcast subscriptions is say support the show, but there are no bonus. There's no bonus content or exclusive content. Like you said, with Patreon, you could do that. With Apple Podcasts, when I first set up our subscription for Apple Insider, I tried putting two benefits, one being ad-free episodes, which I had a couple waves loaded, and early access. But because we were in the middle of publishing episodes, I didn't have one set for early access. And so Apple denied the subscription. I wasn't able to put the subscription through, and I had to change it. I had to take out that early access benefit because in the Apple Podcast dashboard, you can choose the benefits from a dropdown. And so they wanted to really make sure that you had audio already loaded in Podcast Connect that matched the benefit you were offering. And again, unlike Patreon, you don't have access to your listeners as far as if you want to send them a message, if you want to send them merch, or offer other benefits that are not audio related. You just don't have that option in Apple Podcasts. And that's something I don't know if they're going to offer that in the future because they are very big on privacy and they don't want to give you all these email addresses, all these iCloud accounts from the thing. So again, that's something that I don't know. We'll have to see if they'll actually have some kind of mechanism to do that. But before we go too long, I wanted to get your thoughts on this now new wave of live audio, namely Clubhouse, Twitter Spaces, and now even Facebook has gotten in on the game with live audio rooms. And this is, we've had live stream video for a long time. Yeah. And we've had live stream audio. It's just not been very prevalent. And so now we have live audio, and it's kind of the new hot thing as far as, the exciting medium. What do you think about this? Is this something that you think is going to last a long time? Is this kind of like here to stay?
I think in some respects it's here to stay. In quite a lot of respects, I think it was born out of the pandemic, and Clubhouse did a very clever job of signing up a number of influencers. Now that those deals have all finished, Clubhouse is beginning to be quite quiet. If you've ever been in there recently,
I have not, which is why I'm asking this question.
Well, there you go. So I'm on record as saying that Clubhouse is mostly full of the worst people from LinkedIn just with a microphone. I'm
gonna get tweets. I'm gonna get tweets for that one. I'm gonna get tweets.
Yeah,
that's all right.
I think that's possibly slightly over the top. But I think what I found interesting is Clubhouse has a certain vibe to it of people who think they are experts, and to be fair, people who think they're experts more than people who are experts on that platform. Twitter Spaces seems to be much more of a friends platform where you have people who know each other in, I'm going to use the word meat space, sorry, but people who know each other in real life. Real life is a better phrase.
That's M-E-E-T, not M-E-A-T.
Well, I kind of actually meant M-E-A-T, but anyway, yes.
Okay.
Yes, actually, human beings. But anyway, so, Twitter has a very different vibe. Facebook's live rooms are only available to you folks in the US, so therefore the likes of us don't get to play around with those. Also, by the way, podcasts on Facebook are only available in the US as well, which is a mad idea. But anyway, let's not go there. The one that I've been particularly impressed at actually is Spotify's version, which is Spotify Green Room. And what Spotify have done, they have a few additional features in there that actually makes it a really good place to record podcasts. And one of those additional features is you can send messages to people. So you can, there's an ongoing chat, which is actually really handy for knowing which questions you want to actually take from the audience. But it will also automatically record everything and send you an AAC file after the event. So that's really handy in terms of making a show. Yeah. So I've been quite impressed at the Spotify version. And also, by the way, it's available on Android phones as well as on iOS phones, which Clubhouse wasn't for a long time.
Right.
So the 80% of the world that don't use iOS could still actually play along. So I'm really interested in those. I think quite a lot of them haven't yet had the correct tools to allow you to produce something that's good. But I think that Spotify is beginning to get there. And my suspicion is because Spotify has so much access to big stars, particularly in the music world, my suspicion is that we will see a bunch more, integration between Spotify's music product and their social audio service. They announced a couple of weeks ago a sports podcast, which is going to be produced on Spotify Green Room. So after every particular sports ball game, you'll have a sports commentator coming on and, taking questions and, after match reactions and all that kind of stuff, which will then be turned into a podcast afterwards. So they're clearly using the tool to make shows, which is really interesting. So it'll be interesting seeing how that works. In terms of what it replaces, I don't think it replaces podcasts in particular. What I do think is that it has the capacity of replacing is conferences. And there are a bunch of conferences where there are some which are multi-day conferences which you want to go to because you'll bump into people in the corridors and everything else. But there are some shorter conferences that, frankly, you don't want to jump into an aeroplane and travel across, half of the country for.
Sure.
And so if you can do those in an experience like a Twitter Space or a Clubhouse room, and maybe even charge for them, then that seems to be quite an interesting plan for conferences, but maybe not for podcasting and that sort of thing.
Well, let's look towards the future and what we think that might hold. So podcasting, again, in the past has been largely small creator medium individuals, or, I think Twit was probably the largest network for a long time, but now we have huge companies. You have Gimlet, you have Wondery, you have all these big names, and Amazon, Spotify producing their own first-party content. Do you think that there will be room in the future for the small individual creators or small networks as these large companies are kind of not taking over, but really taking a lot of the airwave space or like the mind space of the casual podcast listener?
I think that what we're certainly seeing is a lot of vertical consolidation. What do I mean by that? I mean companies who are buying a hosting company. So Amazon, for example, last week bought R19. Amazon also owns Wondery. Amazon have just bought another podcast called Smartless for $80 million for a podcast. And what they get for that is they get a whole week's exclusive. Wow, brilliant. But anyway, so there's clearly an awful lot of money going on in terms of that. That essentially is how all of the big media companies are working. So SiriusXM owns some ad tech, owns a podcast host, owns a bunch of people making shows. The same goes for iHeartRadio. The same goes for Odyssey, used to be called Entercom, another broadcaster. So we're seeing a bunch of that going on. My suspicion there is that the void that's left of not having large independent producers is probably a good thing, because that essentially means that we will have far more smaller independent production houses who are making niche content. And that's what podcasting is. It's very different to broadcast. Broadcast is, let's reach as many people as we possibly can. Stephen Colbert, will sign him, we'll sign, whoever it is. When you're looking at podcasting, it's a much more niche experience. And so therefore niche content works really, really well. You couldn't necessarily have an awful lot of broadcast TV about the new M1 chip, but you could certainly have an awful lot of podcasts, as I'm sure that you have, around that sort of thing. One of the things I'm particularly excited about is seeing the rise of audio fiction. And the good old days maybe of the 60s and the 50s, when you had drama on the radio and people used to sit round the radio and listen to, Lone Ranger or whatever it was. It's that sort of thing which is happening now. I think Cadence 13 is calling it movies for the ears. And I just love that phrase.
That's cool.
So we're seeing a bunch of that sort of content happening from smaller independent, folks who are making independent shows. And I think that's quite an exciting time. And what we're also seeing is we're seeing, a bunch of individual podcast hosts who are there to help smaller podcasters get in.
Yeah.
I'm an advisor for one called Captivate, which is very good, based in the UK. But there's also, everywhere from Anchor, which is specifically built for tiny podcasters, to Libsyn, Transistor, Simplecast. There are all of these individual hosts.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting is we're seeing more of those, yes, being owned by large media companies, but that means that they can spot you. And as you do an amazing podcast that is beginning to trend and beginning to really take off, they can jump in and say, would you like us to help with your ad sales?
Right.
Would you like us to help with a bit of your promotion, and so on and so forth? So actually that may help get more interesting voices and interesting content into the podcasting world.
Yeah, that's great. Well, do you think podcasting is here to stay, and is there anything you haven't mentioned that you think the future holds for the podcasting industry?
The other big thing that we will see is, historically, as you were saying earlier, Apple has been basically in charge of podcasting. I think quite a lot of people have been calling them a benign dictator.
Right.
They've basically been making the rules because nobody else was. But they've also not had their foot on the gas. I think what we're seeing now that podcasting is actually beginning to earn Apple some money,
right,
I think that we'll see a big change in terms of that, and a big change in terms of how seriously they are taking it. But they also need to, because they have lost the market share that they used to have, which was easily 70% of all downloads. That, I calculate, is down to about 40% now. Spotify is around 30%. And there are an astonishing amount of podcasts now who are putting their show onto Spotify and not caring about Apple because it's too difficult and too complicated.
Wow.
And I think one of the things, I know, it's an amazing thing. I was talking to the folks at Buzzsprout, and they shared some data with me about how many of their new shows are on Spotify and how many are on Apple, and they just and there are way more on Spotify. And the reason for that is, the hassles of signing up for an Apple ID if you don't have one of those, of
Right.
doing the terms and conditions, which you have to have an Apple device for somehow, and all of this kind of stuff. People just can't be bothered. So my suspicion is that we will see one of two things happening. Either Apple will get overtaken by Spotify, and that will be such a loss, I think. Or we will see Apple suddenly realizing, wow, we need to kick everything up a gear here. And, Apple beginning to spend proper money on podcast training, which Spotify have been doing for a while, which Acast have been doing for a while. Apple jumping into that particular space and, doing what they can to regain some of the lost market share.
Yeah.
And if they do that, well, wow, won't that be exciting? Because all of a sudden we know that great competition means that there's great innovation and there's great movement in this space. And that's perhaps something that we haven't had over the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah. All right, my last question. what app do you use to listen to your podcasts?
Well, I have, that's a bad thing to ask an editor of a podcast newsletter because obviously I've got 400 million.
Sure.
I use a Google Pixel. Other phones are available, it turns out. And so therefore, for a while, I was using the Google Podcasts app, which is, it's okay.
Yeah.
But I really use Pocket Casts, which is a great app. It came out originally on Android, and it's very good. Comes from Australia.
Yes.
And is a very good thing. On my iPod Touch, which I have, earlier I was saying that nobody listens to podcasts on their iPod. I do, because I have an iPod Touch so that I can, stick my little toe into the world of iOS every now and again. And so that mostly is running Overcast, which is a great I app.
Yes.
The one that I would recommend, which isn't necessarily a podcast app, it's a bit more than that, is a thing called Hark. I interviewed the CEO of it about a week or so ago, and one of the things it's got in there is, yes, it's got all of the podcasts, and you can have a listen to all the podcasts, and that's great. But what it's also got in there is playlists, or as they call them, Hark lists. And a Hark list is essentially a radio presenter guiding you through a bunch of different shows that are about, I don't know, they might be about the anniversary of the end of slavery, or they might be about the coronavirus, or they might be about whatever they are. And you have this trusted guide who is taking you through individual clips of these individual shows. And it's a great way of finding new podcasts. And I think, that's the sort of innovation that I'm quite excited by. And by the way, the innovation that things like paid subscriptions and indeed Apple's affiliate scheme, which they also have as well, should actually unlock for more folks. So I would certainly recommend giving apps like Hark or Good Pods a try, because that's a great way of finding great new shows that you might want to have a listen to.
I had never heard of Hark, and I'm on their website right now, and this looks beautiful, first of all. And so I'm going to be signing up to be a creator on here for sure. That's awesome. And I will say, my 12-year-old son, we have not gotten him an iPhone yet. And so he too uses an iPod Touch to listen to podcasts. And so
there you go.
You're not the only one left in the world. There are other iPod users as well.
Yeah, it's a very cheap way of being able to try the very latest and greatest on iOS. I do a bunch of testing. I have a podcast called Podclock, which you'll find, which I launched it on April the 1st, and I called it a podcast about time. It is literally a podcast about time. When you play the podcast, it tells you what time it is. But the point of all of that is to do a bunch of testing around individual apps and everything else, and obviously being able to test on the very latest version of iOS and even the upcoming betas has been really, really helpful. So long may the iPod Touch continue to exist as far as I'm concerned.
I hope so. Well, James Cridland, thanks so much for joining us on Apple Insider. Listeners, of course, can read your work and listen to you at podnews.net. Is there anywhere else you would like to point people to discover your content?
Yeah, and if you've got a Siri speaker, then firstly, I am sorry. But secondly, you'll find Podnews on there in the news briefings, as you will, of course, on Google speakers and on Amazon as well.
Very cool. Well, James, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.